The engine died. Marcus froze. Through the windshield, an enormous silverback gorilla stared directly at them, blocking out the light. His massive hands could flip the vehicle in seconds. Marcus had never been this terrified in his life. But what these wild gorillas were about to do next would leave him speechless. This is a story you won't believe until the very end. Before you watch, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss another touching story like this one, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hours earlier, James Carter's Jeep had been racing through the jungle when he saw them. 3 massive gorillas blocking the narrow trail, refusing to move. The silverback, over 200 kilograms of pure muscle, pounded his chest in warning. James cut the engine and waited. Something was terribly wrong. These gorillas never came this close to vehicles. Then he heard it, a desperate cry cutting through the jungle. A baby gorilla was drowning, and its family couldn't reach it. James tapped the horn carefully, attempting to grab their focus without seeming like a threat. 2 of the gorillas stepped aside, but the silverback remained planted, looking straight at James. James looked away from his gaze, understanding that direct eye contact would be taken as a challenge. This wasn't the kind of work he imagined doing when he first signed up as a volunteer more than 10 years earlier, but he discovered that he had to be ready for anything. Right now, he had to call upon the patience and respect needed when dealing with these incredibly strong animals. Standing 50 feet back, James held the steering wheel tightly, his rain jacket drenched from the damp jungle atmosphere. He gave the engine a slight rev, creating just enough sound without coming across as hostile. When the noise traveled through the thick jungle, it caught the interest of the gorilla group, who had all clustered near a rushing stream. During the last 30 minutes, they had been desperately trying to rescue a young family member who had tumbled into the water. The wet rocks and powerful current made it nearly impossible to get close without danger. The infant gorilla was holding onto a snapped branch with all its strength, but things were rapidly getting worse. Everyone was drenched and smeared with mud at this point, yet their rescue attempts hadn't succeeded. Stretching out with their strong arms, none of the adult gorillas could grab the baby firmly without the risk of falling in too. Even worse, while attempting to help, the little gorilla's relatives had accidentally knocked the branch farther away from the shore. The baby's struggles were getting weaker as its energy ran out, and it was sliding nearer to death. The 4-month-old baby cried out desperately, fighting for breath. If it wasn't pulled from the water quickly, it would either drown or freeze to death. The little gorilla's name was Jabari, and he was the youngest member of a family living in the Virunga Mountain Gorilla Sanctuary. This protected refuge was one of the last safe places for mountain gorillas, but even here, danger lurked everywhere. Poachers, shrinking forests, and not enough food, the threats never stopped. While rangers looked on at what seemed like a lost cause, they prepared themselves for the first death in over 30 years. Not one of the rangers could get to little Jabari, while the family kept trying to save him. The clock was working against them. That's when James came up with his daring plan. He decided to use sounds and movements to pull the family's attention away from Jabari. Getting them to separate from the baby would be extremely difficult, and something he never thought he'd attempt. However, with his whole crew observing and hoping for success, James felt even more determined to guide them to victory, and inhaled one final deep breath. He picked up a container of non-harmful smoke repellent while getting ready for his approach. Following a signal to his crew, James and 2 other rangers carefully advanced on foot, holding long sticks and shouting loudly. Now they formed a wall of people, swinging the sticks and releasing smoke clouds between the gorilla family and the water. This caught the silverback's focus, who paused his rescue work to check out what was threatening them. The strategy was succeeding. The family gradually backed away into the jungle, and James positioned his crew to prevent them from getting back to the infant. He told the Rangers to keep the barrier in place. They maintained their positions 2 times just to be certain, but that was merely half the task. At this point, he needed to begin the actual rescue. He shouted for Marcus to assist him, quickly took off his jacket, and stepped cautiously into the freezing stream. A fellow ranger called Marcus came along. Marcus had grown up in a small village in Rwanda, dreaming of protecting the mountain gorillas he'd heard stories about since childhood. Now, on only his first week at the sanctuary, his eyes showed clear terror. But recognizing how urgent the situation was, Marcus went into the stream with James without any hesitation. Reaching out to take hold of the baby would be simpler than attempting to shift the branch. Despite being only an infant, the gorilla weighed somewhere between 3 and 4 kilograms and might bite out of fear. A rope and safety harness sat ready with the remaining Rangers, but speed was essential. The frigid water posed a serious threat to little Jabari. There wasn't time to delay any further. James, working together with Marcus, advanced carefully through the flowing water, checking that each step was secure on the slick rocks. Then, another problem emerged. The distraction technique had only been effective briefly. Glancing up past the plants, James spotted the silverback heading back in their direction, his urge to protect overwhelming his caution. He commanded 2 Rangers to hold the barrier and continue making noise. They carried air horns and an extra smoke container, which they'd deploy if the silverback made a charge. As a final option, James shouted at them to delay using the tranquilizer dart. He had faith in the gorillas, and he hoped they could wrap up the rescue without delay. Instead, the Rangers set off the air horns in quick blasts. The unfamiliar noise bewildered the silverback briefly, buying them some extra moments, but it wasn't sufficient. The family began advancing toward them once more, moving even quicker, with the silverback pounding his chest and rushing forward in threatening displays. The Rangers stood firm and rapidly checked sideways to observe James and Marcus's progress. They began losing hope, getting the tranquilizer weapon ready. The Rangers' fingers trembled as they braced for the absolute worst. At the same time, tiny Jabari fought to maintain his grip on the branch. Following several nerve-wracking moments, James at last got to the baby and carefully yet decisively freed him from the branch. For little Jabari it seemed like forever. When the Rangers had shown up just moments before, he had been on the verge of losing hold entirely. Raising the shaking baby against his torso, James figured he had barely enough time to examine how he was doing. Jabari was shaking uncontrollably, completely soaked and freezing. While keeping him safe in his arms, James inspected his eyes, mouth, and respiration. Working alongside Marcus, he saw that the baby displayed clear symptoms of dangerous body temperature loss. This indicated one thing: they had to get him warm right away. And judging by how Jabari had wound up in the water, James understood something else. The family had been moving too fast, too desperately. They were struggling to find food. The jungle that had once provided everything was disappearing, and the gorillas were being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces. They hurried back to the protected area of the vehicle right as an emotional family reunion took place, with Jabari's mother rushing toward them. She made deep vocal sounds, obviously upset by everything that had occurred, and rapidly took Jabari out of James's hands. She looked over the infant thoroughly, searching for wounds exactly as James had done. She made quiet grunting sounds showing relief before pulling him against her warm body. She also appeared to give a soft tap on the head, as if warning him to remain near before securing the baby tightly to her chest. While the family moved further back into the jungle all together again, this showed a mother who was both annoyed and relieved, which anyone could understand. Taking everything into account, it had been a successful operation. Getting back to the main buildings, most of the team felt satisfied with what they'd accomplished, But James and Marcus weren't in the mood to celebrate. They couldn't stop thinking about the desperation they'd seen in that mother's eyes. The truth hit them hard. Saving Jabari had only bought time. The gorillas were running out of space. Their forest home was shrinking every day. Food was getting scarce. And if nothing changed, more babies would be in danger. This wasn't just about one rescue. It was about survival. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the rescue over and over. The terror in Jabari's eyes, the mother's desperate cries, the family's frantic attempts to reach their baby. There had to be a way to help them, permanently. The next morning, he came to James with an idea. It was risky, maybe even crazy, but it could work. What if they could create safe pathways? Protected routes that would let the gorillas reach more of the jungle without danger from poachers? James listened carefully. The plan was bold. Build barriers high enough to guide the gorillas to new territory while keeping threats out. It would take weeks of work in the dangerous jungle. But looking at Marcus's determined face, seeing the fire in the eyes of this young man who'd traveled so far to protect these animals, James knew they had to try. For Jabari, for the whole family, for every gorilla that called this place home. The construction began immediately. Day after day, they worked in the mud and rain, building barriers that would give the gorilla families room to breathe. Marcus worked alongside the crew, his hands blistered and bleeding, but he never stopped. The gorillas watched from the trees, curious about these strange new structures appearing in their home. Little Jabari watched too, clinging to his mother's chest. Healthy and strong now. They had no idea how much their lives were about to change. Finally, after 3 weeks of backbreaking work, it was done. Now came the test. Would the gorillas understand? Would they trust these new pathways? The silverback approached first, cautious and suspicious. He reached out slowly, touched the barrier, and jumped back from the mild shock. He tested it 2 more times, then made warning sounds to the others. The message was clear. This is a boundary. Don't cross it. But then something beautiful happened. The silverback noticed what lay beyond the barriers. Fresh territory they hadn't been able to reach safely before. New food sources. Space to roam without fear. Room for the family to grow. Within days, everything changed. The gorillas spread out into the new areas, exploring with a freedom they hadn't known in years. The forest that had been stripped bare began to recover. There was enough food for everyone. The tension that had hung over the family for months melted away. Mothers played with their babies without the constant worry of where the next meal would come from. They were safe. They were fed. They could thrive. Marcus was offered a permanent position. It was everything he'd dreamed of since he was a boy in Rwanda, listening to stories about the mountain gorillas. But something still held him back, something he couldn't quite name. Was this really where he belonged? Then, 3 weeks later, during what should have been a routine patrol, everything became clear. The gorilla family emerged from the vegetation without warning, surrounding their vehicle in seconds. Marcus's heart pounded. The silverback moved closer, his massive body blocking the sun. James twisted the key. Nothing. The engine coughed and died. They were trapped. The gorillas had watched Marcus laboring in the jungle for weeks, building those barriers. They remembered when James had used smoke and loud sounds to separate them from baby Jabari. What would they do now? Marcus crouched down in his seat, trying to find protection. His first year out of college, and this was how it would end. The gorillas pressed closer, casting dark shadows across the truck. James tried the ignition again. Nothing. His hands gripped the wheel. There was no escape. Then a sound. A low rumbling filled the air. But it wasn't aggression. It was something else entirely. Marcus slowly lifted his head and looked out the window. The silverback sat peacefully near the truck, making soft, rhythmic beats on his chest. Not violent pounds, gentle, steady taps, like a drum gathering in the middle of the jungle. More sounds joined in, soft grunts, pleased humming. The whole family was gathered around them, but there was no threat in their eyes, only recognition, only gratitude. Even little Jabari, the baby they'd saved, stepped forward, healthy and energetic. He reached out with curiosity, touching the truck's mirror with his tiny hand. His mother stood close behind, watching peacefully, and for a brief moment her eyes met James's. In that gaze, James saw something profound, a mother's thanks. They sat frozen, surrounded by these magnificent creatures. The silverback continued his gentle chest beats. The family made their peaceful sounds. In that moment, watching little Jabari reach out with trust, seeing the mother's grateful eyes, Marcus felt something shift inside him. All his doubts, all his questions about whether this was the right path, they melted away like morning mist in the jungle. These animals remembered, they understood. They were saying thank you in the only way they could. When the family finally disappeared back into the forest and the engine roared back to life, Marcus didn't need to think anymore. James glanced at him, and Marcus simply nodded. The boy from Rwanda who'd dreamed of protecting gorillas had found his calling. This was it. This was exactly where he belonged. Did you enjoy this story? Would you have done everything in your power to save that baby gorilla? Yes or no? Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.